The B-24 Liberator is reasonably well remembered today, though perhaps not so well as it should be, considering it is the most produced heavy bomber in history. Indeed, it is the most produced combat aircraft ever built by the United States, which is quite a feat when you think about it. But somewhat ironically, when you hear discussions about the Big Lib, especially as a Brit, you often hear it referred to not for its bombing missions, but for the contribution it made to one specific campaign, the Battle of the Atlantic. The B-24 really was a significant weapon in this campaign alone, with its long range enabling the Allies to finally close the Atlantic Gap, where German U-boats had been able to prowl without fear of Allied air cover, making the Kriegsmarine's submarines far more dangerous and successful hunters. By forcing the U-boats to operate submerged more of the time, plus the development of better anti-submarine sensors and weapons, the B-24 really began to turn the screws on the German attempts to throttle transatlantic traffic. So successful was the aircraft in the role that it was employed in large numbers by both the United States Army Air Force and the US Navy for maritime patrol. And ultimately, this led to a special variant being built for the US Navy, the PB4Y-1, of which alone just under 1,000 were built. However, despite the success of the B-24 in this maritime patrol / anti-submarine role, it ironically really wasn't all that suitable. The B-24 had been developed as a high-altitude heavy bomber, and this meant that it had some very notable deficiencies for the job, particularly in its handling. After all, the requirements for maneuverability in a bomber trudging along high in the sky are very different from one getting heavily buffeted by a storm just a few hundred feet above the North Atlantic, while trying to line up a depth charge attack on a rapidly submerging target. So in 1942, the US Navy, fully appreciating the need for a proper dedicated patrol and anti-submarine aircraft, requested that Consolidated have a go at reworking it to make it more suitable for their needs. And that they did, creating the PB4Y-2 privateer. While its roots in the Liberator are clear to see, equally clear are some of the changes that Consolidated made to the aircraft to make it more suitable for its specific requirements. Most notable is the big single fin, which replaced the twin-tail configuration of the B-24. This was added to improve the aircraft's handling at low altitudes, and proved so successful that it became slated to become the standard for the later models of the B-24, though the end of the war saw that never come to pass. For more on that, check out my video on the B-24K and Ns, link will be at the end of this video. In addition, though the 4 twin Wasp radial engines fitted on the B-24 were retained on the privateer, they did not have turbochargers fitted, as these were required for high altitude performance and therefore not necessary, as well as adding quite a bit of weight to the aircraft, so cutting them was quite a sensible move. In addition to this, a 7-foot extension was added to the fuselage so that accommodation could be made for a flight engineer. The US Navy thought this necessary because the extra workload of flying very long missions at low levels would put additional pressure on the pilots, so having the extra crewmen whose job it was to manage the engines would be a smart move. Also changed was the defensive armament to better reflect the operational altitude the privateer was expected to operate at. Instead of the all-round defence of the high-flying B-24, the belly ball turret was omitted because the aircraft would be flying low-level patrol missions, protecting its belly from fighters by getting close to the deck. Instead, the protection from attack from above was beefed up, and the privateer had not one, but 2 powered turrets on the spine of the aircraft, each carrying twin 50 caliber heavy machine guns. This was further complemented by powered turrets with the same armament in nose, tail, and in both waist positions. These waist guns could rotate to also cover much of the underside of the aircraft, further relieving the need for the belly gun. All in all, the privateer was intended to give any enemy fighter a very warm reception. And this proved necessary, as though the big patrol aircraft didn't deploy overseas until January 1945, they were soon in the thick of it, patrolling and fighting actions all across the Pacific. The type experienced its first combat loss on January the 12th and its last on August the 14th, with a total of 61 privateers being lost to all causes between October 1944 and the end of the war in August 1945. This might seem a lot, but it is also an indication of just how much use the PB4Y-2s were seeing, sometimes flying missions for up to 16 hours. Privateers scoured the Pacific not just for enemy vessels, but also conducting search and rescue and electronic warfare missions, as well as reporting on the weather. Because the privateer was an exceptionally well thought out and capable aircraft for its day. In addition to the guns, the PB4Y-2 could carry some 12,800 pounds of ordnance, composed of bombs, torpedoes, or mines, as well as including a revolutionary new weapon, the ASM-N2 BAT, two of which could be carried by the big patrol aircraft. This standoff guided weapon combined an active radar seeker and a 1,000-pound bomb, and with it the privateer attacked Japanese shipping in the last year of the war. In April 1945, they were able to give the BAT its combat debut off the coast of Borneo, dropping the weapons at up to 23 miles from their targets, strikes that accounted for a number of Japanese merchantmen and at least one warship. In addition to its armaments, the privateer was well equipped for locating and designating targets in this standoff role. The aircraft was fitted with an AN/APS-2 radar in a retractable radome and an advanced signal intelligence suite, composed of multiple types of radar and radio intercept sets, as well as direction finding and jammers, all stored on racks in what today we would term a modular setup. The design allowed the privateers to switch out different equipment for different missions, and this comprehensive setup not only helped the aircraft locate and identify maritime targets at a good range, but also meant that the privateer was to enjoy a rather active and dangerous post-war career. As the Cold War got more and more fraught, privateers were one of the primary aircraft employed by the United States to monitor what was going on in the Soviet Union and their associated allies. Flying missions referred to as ferrets, privateers monitored electronic signals by prowling close to the coastlines of these nations of interest. And unfortunately, this quite often got a response. On the 8th of April 1950, a PB4Y-2 of Patrol Squadron 26, nicknamed Turbulent Turtle, was conducting a ferret mission over the Baltic Sea when it was bounced by 4 Soviet La-11 fighters somewhere off the coast of what is now Latvia. Though the exact circumstances are still disputed, what is known for sure is that the privateer was shot down, with the loss of the entire crew of 10 men. With the outbreak of the Korean War in June 1950, privateers became very active in the conflict, patrolling the peninsula's coastline looking for North Korean and later Chinese infiltrators, as well as providing flare illumination for Navy and Marine night attack aircraft. But it also meant that the privateers found themselves flying in more dangerous waters. And on 2 occasions in 1952, PB4Ys flying patrols off the coast of China were attacked by Chinese Communist MiG-15s, though fortunately on both occasions the aircraft were able to escape. Privateers also found themselves very active in non-combat roles, serving as meteorological aircraft and with the US Coast Guard for search and rescue. But, and as you know if you've seen my video on the P4M Mercator, link also at the end, hint hint, the US Navy was beginning to think about a replacement for the privateer even before it got into service, and the big planes were gradually phased out of frontline use by the US, being replaced in the US Navy by 1954 and with the last leaving the Coast Guard in 1958. But this was not the end for the privateer. Far from it. 22 were supplied to the French Navy in 1950, who used them throughout their conflict in Indochina, where the aircraft were used as conventional bombers, with at least 2 being lost on operations there. With the end of that war in 1954, the French transferred them to North Africa, where they were then used fighting Algerian independence fighters of the FLN. Here they were again used as heavy bombers, as well as reprising their role as flare droppers for attack aircraft such as F-4 Corsairs and A-1 Sky Raiders engaging FLN guerrillas at night. Again, this duty had its fair share of hazards, and 4 aircraft were lost. And the French privateers also had the dubious distinction of being used in the abortive Anglo-French invasion of Egypt in 1956, the so-called Suez Affair. Ultimately, the French aircraft, after this rather hectic service life, were retired in 1960. Also seeing long and very active lives were the privateers supplied to the nationalist Chinese Air Force on Taiwan. Between 1952 and 1956, some 38 PB4Y-2s were supplied to the nationalists, and they saw all sorts of odd work with them, often flying secret missions which are still shrouded in mystery. Take, for example, the last privateer to be lost in combat, a nationalist PB4Y-2 that was shot down in February 1961 by Hawker Sea Furies of the Burmese Air Force. This odd incident has its roots in the collapse of the nationalist Chinese and their defeat by the communists in 1949. While the nationalist forces escaped to Taiwan is well known, what isn't so well remembered is what happened to the nationalist forces in the west of the country. They only had one escape option: west into the newly independent country of Burma. Here the nationalist Chinese established strong bases, essentially independent fiefdoms, that aimed to create a new army to drive the communists out of China. And to pay for this, they took over and massively expanded the local opium and heroin trade, founding what is known of today as the Golden Triangle. The whole history of this is fascinating and deserves its own video for coverage. But needless to say, by 1960, both the Chinese communists and the Burmese government were thoroughly fed up with the narcotic-fueled warlords on their respective border and worked together to crush them. In early 1961, the nationalist forces were in full retreat in northern Burma, and in order to help them, the Taiwanese, who had maintained links with them ever since 1949, were dropping weapons and supplies to their beleaguered cousins. This all led up to the incident in question, where 3 Burmese Sea Furies intercepted a nationalist privateer attempting to parachute supplies to their retreating forces, which led to both the PB4Y and a Sea Fury getting shot down. This incident pretty much marked the end of the type's combat career, but privateers would carry on flying for a lot longer yet. 3 supplied to the Honduran Air Force flew as transports until the 1970s, while a number sold to civilian operators in Latin America flew freight and passenger services until well into the 1960s. But even longer serving were those purchased by the aerial firefighting companies from surplus US Coast Guard aircraft. These privateers often had their Twin Wasp engines replaced with more powerful Wright Cyclones that produced 1,700 horsepower each in comparison to the Twin Wasp's 1,350 horsepower. Aircraft which had this modification made were redesignated as super privateers by their operators, and all of them had the ability to carry up to 18,000 pounds of fire retardant for dropping on wildfires. The big aircraft, with their roomy fuselages and specialisation for low-level operations, were just about perfect aerial firefighters, and these aircraft literally served for decades. In fact, they did this job right up until 2002, when one of the aircraft was tragically lost in flight when one of its wings came apart, killing the crew of 2. As it was, crash investigation concluded that the accident seems to have been caused due to poor maintenance by the company then operating the aircraft, as they lost a much newer C-130A Hercules to a similar problem the same year. Despite this, the loss led to the grounding of the remaining PB4Ys due to concerns on their age, which seems ironically both unfair as a smirch on the privateer, which was obviously built like a beast, but also completely reasonable. After all, the aircraft lost had actually been flying since 1945 and had been converted to its new role as a firefighter way back in 1958, clocking over 8,000 flight hours in that time, which, considering these would have been primarily at low level, getting buffeted by sea winds or massive thermals from forest fires, is pretty good going and a great credit to the builders at Consolidated. On top of that was the fact that the fleet of firefighting privateers had suffered considerable attrition to their numbers over the years of flying these dangerous low-level operations, and it was beyond time for the remaining old warhorses to go out to pasture. In total, 739 privateers were built before the orders were slashed at the end of the Second World War. Of those, one is still reportedly airworthy, while 7 are preserved as museum exhibits at various locations around the United States, which is a nice tribute for a tough and capable aircraft that today is hardly remembered, but which served far longer and in far more roles than just about any of its contemporaries.